And next, coming up, we have the manager of airport planning at Hoyle Tanner and Associates, also formerly of the Cape Cod Gateway Airport, somebody that knows the Cape, that knows aviation. So excited to have her up. Please put your hands together for Katie Servis. And last but not least, somebody who I have met in different spaces while preparing for this event on the Cape, very involved with the Climate Change Collaborative and in a lot of different spaces. But right now, we're excited to welcome up the founder and chairman of Cape Air. He's a former Massachusetts state senator. Please put your hands together for Dan Wolf.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We have the very tough job of keeping you awake after lunch. If you're anything like me, I'm usually falling asleep at my desk at this time, so maybe if we all give a little wiggle, let's stand up. How about that? Do we all want to stand up? Maybe stretch. Maybe high five your neighbor. We're all energized? We're all ready? All right. Well, welcome back. We're so excited and honored to be part of this discussion today. The discussions so far have been so impactful, so many passionate people in the room. So really just honored to be a part of it, and I know the panelists are as well. As Wes said, my name is Kelsey Frenkiel. I'm currently the Director of Sustainability at the GBTA Foundation. I'll tell you a little bit about what that is because, I know when I started my job at GBTA, I certainly didn't know much about business travel. Although when they asked me if I did in my interview, I said, oh yes, I know a lot about business travel, and quickly realized that I really didn't. So I actually started out my career in primate conservation. So I did a master's at Oxford Brookes University and studied the impact of tourism on wildlife conservation. That landed me my first internship with Crest, where I worked with Martha and Samantha and many others. And after that, I moved on to GBTA, where we work with the entire ecosystem of companies that rely on business travel to meet their business objectives, and all of the travel suppliers that facilitate that. So the airlines, the hotels, et cetera. And when I talk about business travel, I'm not necessarily talking about folks flying in private jets. I'm not even always talking about people flying in business class. I'm talking about every single one of you, every person in this room that came here today and felt that it was important to be here either for yourself or for your business. So I'm excited to dive into that today and talk specifically about how aviation can help facilitate that. I want to ask my panelists, they've already been introduced, but maybe to talk a little bit more about their background and how you got into aviation in the first place.
Sure. Thanks, Kelsey. Katie Servis. I am the manager of aviation planning with Hoyle Tanner and Associates. But prior to that, I did a lot of work with aviation planning for other consulting firms, and then I moved on to work for the State Aeronautics Division. I was in their environmental team for airports. I did a lot of work with our airports, the 36 airports across the state, that really were dealing with climate change and wildlife issues at their facilities. And then from there, I moved on to Cape Cod Gateway Airport. I was the manager there for 10 years. That's where I really met Dan and got introduced to Cape Air and their operations at the facility. And we really started a great friendship, I would say, both passionate about what we do in aviation, but we come from it with many different ideas to bring forward that include looking at sustainability. Now that I'm working for Hoyle Tanner and Associates, I have the great pleasure of working with a lot of different airports that are starting to dabble in these issues, or starting to look at sustainability for their infrastructure and how they can build out their facilities to incorporate that. So it's really kind of exciting times for me because I'm able to bring all of that together and work with other airports and get an understanding of what they're dealing with in their community as well as their infrastructure. So, Dan?
Who here thinks the term sustainable aviation is an oxymoron? Anyway, it is, one hand goes up, but be more bold. Anyway, it is an honor and a pleasure to be here. this is such an exciting forum, and I really love being up here on stage with you guys. And Katie, it is a friendship, and it's a lot of mutual admiration too. I hope mutual. It's certainly admiration going your way. I learned to fly here on Cape Cod as a pilot, fledgling. I was a kid at the airport fence who just everything that flew by I loved. And he says, you can all hear me, right? Now you can hear me better, right? Oh my God, I just got total stage fright. So I learned to fly here on the Cape 48 years ago. And I was a kid who just had a passion for flying airplanes. So that when we talk about the environment and a love of Cape Cod and everything about it, I have had the privilege and pleasure of flying over this place for 48 years. And in the process of doing that, I have learned so much about the impact of human growth, what we have done as we have grown and developed the Cape. But I've also had a front row seat to what the environment is doing, to climate change. And I can take any 10-year period in that almost 50 years and really see the Cape and what's happening here very differently. I can tell you in the late 70s, the development pressures on the Cape were completely different, and the environmental impact was very different. We would get occasional storms and nor'easters that had a certain impact, but nothing like what's going on now, which is a normal high tide, full moon. There's bad stuff happening, and that's because in the last 50 years, sea level rise here on the Cape is between 6 and 12 inches. So it is a real thing. In addition to having that bird's eye view, I have served on the board of what I would say are probably two of the biggest environmental organizations on the Cape. The Association to Preserve Cape Cod, I don't know if anybody is here from there, and also I currently serve on the board of the Center for Coastal Studies, which is really involved in understanding what's going on in the seas around us and what climate change is doing to that. And also, we're the global leader in preservation of the right whale and really trying to work with that whale population to sustain it and see it grow again. So a lot of different hats. I was also the chair of the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce for a time, and then in 1989 started scheduled air service with one airplane between Provincetown and Boston. By the way, that was the same year that Bill McGibbon wrote the book, The End of Nature. Has anybody read that book or heard of Bill McGibbon or anything? Okay, so read that book, because the context of it is, you started an airline and you're responsible for destroying the environment. When we started the airline in 1989, the consciousness of climate change and what carbon was doing, the role carbon was playing, was really not well known. And I will just say, in sort of closing as my introduction, each year that went by between 1989 and when I stepped down as CEO at Cape Air 3 years ago, I became more and more cognizant and aware of the impact that our small airline was having on the environment, and also in the broader sense what aviation has been, the impact aviation has been having, which is really near and dear to why we're all here today. We were the first airline to start a sustainability program. Our vice president and director of sustainability, Pete Farrell, Pete, you want to wave, is actually here today to really help in the aviation effort to really become more sustainable, or a better partner relative to making sure that the impact we're having on our destinations is as consistent and compatible and collaborative with those destinations as possible. So we started a sustainability program at Cape Air about 10 or 12 years ago. We built on our hangar roof the first, the biggest, what was at the time the biggest solar project in southeastern Massachusetts. And our sustainability program, and we might get into it if we have time, has just evolved over time to, in partnership with our airports, and Katie will talk about that a little bit, but also in partnership with our communities and with our employees. What can an airline do to be sustainable? So I look forward to talking about that. Really a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you both so much. I want to start actually with a question to the audience. You didn't know you were going to be involved in this panel, but you are. How many people in this room flew here today for this meeting? Okay, so maybe half? Would you say half? Yeah. So clearly, it was important enough to you to be here, both cost-wise and emissions-wise, that you were willing to get on a plane to come here. I flew as well, by the way. So we're all part of the aviation ecosystem, right? So just putting that into context, it's an important lever. A lot of, we haven't really seen what the world looks like without aviation. It connects us, it connects our businesses, it connects our families. And so how do we operate that in a way that is more sustainable and perhaps even regenerative? I don't know the answer to that, but hopefully my panelists do, and we're going to talk about that today. So kind of going back to what you just said, Dan, when you said sustainable aviation. What does that even mean? What does sustainable aviation mean to both of you?
I would say from an airport infrastructure standpoint that sustainable aviation is, from an airport management standpoint, is looking at ways that you can partner with your tenants on the airfield, such as Cape Air, to look at how you can be impactful in the way that you balance your infrastructure. So whether that's putting in charging stations that enable vehicles and electric aviation to charge, or you take different approaches to how you design your buildings so that you can put solar on your buildings, make space on your airport infrastructure for solar. Just to give you an example, at the time in 2014 when Cape Cod Gateway Airport put a 20-acre array, ground-based solar array on the airport, that ground-based solar array could operate all of the buildings on the airfield that were airport owned. So the tower, the terminal, and some of the other hangar facilities, plus all of the lighting on the airfield. It was enough of a power source to be able to operate all of those facilities. That's being sustainable. That is looking at how you can better utilize your land, because it's not all about aviation. It's about aviation and non-aviation sources, because you have to have a balanced approach. You have to look at your impact, no matter who you are, what type of business you're in. From a transportation standpoint, it is your obligation, and this is how I passionately feel about it, it is your obligation to look at ways that you can reduce your impact. No matter how small it is, it will add up.
So that's why we became such good friends, is because while Katie was doing that from the public sector running an airport, one of her tenants, which was Cape Air, which was at the time becoming what was the largest independent regional carrier in the country. So Cape Air went from one little airplane to we had 105 airplanes at our peak, and we were serving destinations in New England, but also as far away as the Caribbean and Guam out in the Western Pacific. So as our footprint as an airline grew, we were looking more and more for ways to partner with public sector, whether it be airports or whether it be other governmental agencies, to really reduce the impact and mitigate the impact of what we were doing. So our sustainability program, working with the airports, from everything to recycling to energy production, storage, and ultimately how to use it. In 2016, we actually found a company, at the time was based in Israel, and then they moved over to Seattle, which was building a 9-passenger, all-electric airplane called Aviation. And we worked with them for about 5 or 6 years trying to get their airplane into production. And it did actually fly at one point, but unfortunately that company is sort of on mothballs now. We had made an order for 75 all-electric airplanes because the profile of the way we operate our airline is, it's all short haul. We have a hub, like for example our hub in San Juan, and all of our flights are less than about 150 miles. So we are sort of the perfect launch customer for electric aviation, because the first implementation of electric aviation is going to be in small occupancy, short haul transportation. And so you're going to hear more and more about that. And there are probably 4 or 5 companies now that are building, I would say it's going to be competitive, airplanes that we might be able to operate. But for us, it was about what can we do as a private company, but what then can we do in collaboration with whatever public entity we can work with to really try to make aviation more sustainable, compatible, harmonious with the environments and the communities that we serve.
Yeah, and you picked up on a word that I want to talk about, which is community. Obviously, when we think of the impact of aviation, we think a lot about the fact that it's a hard-to-abate sector. It's all about emissions, but I know, transport and aviation specifically is an economic engine for a lot of communities. So is it about that economic impact as well and the social impact?
I think it's a balance between both. I think you have to look at it from an economic standpoint. You have to understand, the return on investment for the infrastructure that you're putting in, but then you also have to balance it with what's good for the community. So when you start talking about electric aviation and those short haul routes, that's ideal for this location for the Cape, especially with Cape Air going to the islands and from Boston to Provincetown. It makes sense to have an aircraft like that to be able to have the impact. It it's an expensive endeavor to get into. So you have to think about what is the payback as well. It's not only is it the environment, but it's also the support of the company and what they can do. Same thing from an aviation airport management standpoint. You want to put in charging stations. Okay, how do we put in those charging stations? Some of these stations are about $800,000 to install because of the robust charging that they have to have. You put in those charging stations, that's not chump change. But you have to have a cheerleader that is willing to look at all angles and all ways to be able to install something like that so that you know that you're doing it what's good for the airport and the transportation industry, but you're also doing it for the good of the community that surrounds you. So you have to balance that and say, okay, is that $800,000 worth the investment that we're going to do? And in the long run, those are the questions that you're asking yourself. But again, it's a balancing act, and you do have to balance that.
Yeah, a quick story about the community impact part of it, too. At one point, our first route was Provincetown to Boston, which is a great route because it's a 120-mile drive and it's a 40-mile flight. So it's sort of perfect as far as launching. But we got pressure as soon as we started service in Provincetown in 1989 to do direct service to New York City. And in order to do that, we would have needed to extend the runway, which is challenging enough because it's in a national park. But the conversation I had as somebody who loves Cape Cod as much as Mark does, who you heard earlier, I really was questioning whether or not it was the right thing for the community in Provincetown. Provincetown's about 3,000 year-round residents. It goes up to as high as 40 to 50,000 in the summer, so very seasonal. But what I said is, be really careful what you ask for. Is it the right thing for the community to have nonstop service from New York City to Provincetown? And I think that's exactly the kind of conversation that private sector transportation providers should be having with communities in a really thoughtful way. Because I said, don't forget that while you're making it easy to get from Provincetown to New York City, you're also opening up New York City to Provincetown nonstop in ways that you may look back at and regret. So in fact, that conversation stopped because it's hard to get to Provincetown from New York because you have to one stop through Boston, and that impediment enough to connect with a Cape Air flight has sort of kept Provincetown, and I think it really preserves some of the community character. So Katie had the same issues at Gateway Airport when we talked about JetBlue coming into Gateway Airport, American Airlines, and sort of there's a tremendous pressure to grow the business side, but then you really have to be looking at the community impact too, as well as the environmental impact.
So you're feeling pressure from one side of the things in terms of, you're operating as a business at the end of the day, right? Mm-hmm. But you also have to work with the community in order to ensure that your business and your goals are successful, right? We had a discussion upstairs about the different terminologies that are used. Like, we don't say ecotourism anymore, and then we started using sustainability, and now we're using regenerative, and what does it really all mean? But for me, it's always been about balance when I think of what sustainability really means. And Katie, you used that word balance when I asked you that question earlier. And I would really love for you to kind of dive deep into I'll call it a case study from an academic perspective, your case study of the efforts that you took at Cape Cod Gateway Airport. So tell us more about what you did. Was it successful? What challenges did you face along the way? And what was that kind of balancing act that you played?
Thank you for that question. I think I'll use two case studies, sorry. The first one is really the impetus of the airport getting more involved with solar generation and power generation was really through Cape Air. Cape Air was so passionate about what they wanted to do within their own company that just filtered through to the airport, and we got on board with that. And that was a really good story because your brother Jim started the conversation with Liz Argo, who is around here somewhere, with Liz, to get the 20-acre solar array that was installed at the airport. That came from the idea of Cape Air to the airport, and then with our community to talk about putting that solar system into the airport. And it's been a fantastic system. It's 7 megawatts of power for the airport, and that's great. The airport will own that system in 10 years from now. They'll own that system, which means that the airport can use that power for other means, such as case study number 2, which is the smart microgrid development that we're working on. I say we, sorry. The airport is working on. right now with Mastar Aeronautics. Mastar Aeronautics wanted to find an airport that was keen on implementing sustainability at their facility, to use that airport as a test case to look at microgrid development at other airport facilities across the Commonwealth. So they chose Cape Cod Gateway Airport. We started a study to implement a smart microgrid plan where we would have backup power generation at the airport facility, so that during peak moments when perhaps Cape Air with their electric aircraft, during peak times, they would have that smart grid technology to tap into, so that they can pull power from that system, maybe at a lower rate than what they would be paying to the grid. They could tap into that power so that they could stimulate their electric aviation power right at the airport. That involved also putting in more solar and more charging stations. Before I left the airport, we had gotten to about 50% design of what that plan would look like, and I'm happy to say that they're continuing with the program. So hopefully within the next couple of years, you'll see a microgrid station, very similar to what was put down in Provincetown at the airport, to really kickstart the airport's true sustainability, and working with the partners at Cape Air to make sure that that happens, that they have a reliable source of power on the Cape to continue their operations. So that, it was a win-win for both companies, for the airport and for Cape Air, I think.
And jumping off of that, Dan, how did all of these efforts help to facilitate, your sustainability goals?
From a technical standpoint, it's holistically a beautiful story, right? You've got the public sector at the airport actually developing a generation of power, batteries to store it, developing a microgrid that then the private operator can plug into. One of the misconnects is when we went to the electric aircraft manufacturers, their economic business model was based on paying about 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And I think, Katie, you and I discussed probably into the airplane, because there has to be some way to amortize the investment in the infrastructure as well as the electricity. I think we were talking about 50 cents a kilowatt hour. So clearly our economic model for an electric airplane doesn't work at 50 cents a kilowatt hour, which I think gets then into the whole role of what is the public responsibility and role. Should there be a subsidy to bridge the gap to make the economics work or not? What is the policy side of, and I'll just put my state senator hat on for a second, working in the State House representing what I always called the best damn state Senate district in the United States, which is the Cape and Islands. There might be some disagreement in the room here, but I got to represent this place for 3 terms in the Massachusetts State Senate. What was really interesting to me, sort of coming out of a private sector job and into a public sector, public policy position, is to really sort of understand the appropriate role of government and business as far as driving what I call democracy, the civic expression of our collective will. Like, how do we get both sides to deliver an outcomes that we want? And it's really important. I mean, that's an important conversation. You don't do it in 35 minutes, but I do think it's a really important conversation. I will say, just to be controversial for a minute, the idea that we are going to have investor-driven private companies that are motivated to return to investor and develop technologies, to have that be consistent and compatible with what our long-term public policy goals are, is happenstance. Markets don't necessarily drive outcomes that are consistent with what we want our democratic expression to be relative to policy. And I'll take transportation and aviation as an example. We should not be looking at aviation in a silo. We should be looking at aviation as part of a holistic approach to transportation. And if you ask me what's the smartest way to get someone to Provincetown, it's probably on a train that were commissioned in the mid-1800s and decommissioned in like the 1940s when they built roads and when the automobile took over. Now most of that rail is now a rail trail. It's a bicycle path, which is a wonderful use of it, but boy, do I wish we still had rail service out Cape Cod. And one last thing on that is, if you look at Logan Airport, which has a capacity and a congestion issue, and you look at about half of the flights at Logan Airport, half of the operations go to New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, and understand if we had high-speed rail up and down the East Coast, what that would mean relative to the pressure on air transportation. You can sort of see the rubric of looking at transportation holistically, and then asking the private sector to do what we have decided is the best outcome for transportation. I know that's heady for this conference, but I do think it's something we should all be thinking about. Not only is it right for aviation, but is it sort of right for environmental outcomes and for overall transportation policy outcomes?
I was just going to hit on something a little bit differently from what Dan had said. You know, obviously policy, taking a policy view of this is a very important approach. But I think one of the things that as an airport manager, you have to realize that sometimes those are lagging. So your management, as a manager, you have to be willing to take that strategic plan to put green technologies or put this type of technology in place at your airport and be able to use sometimes your own reserves and not go after the grant funds that you hope will be there. You have to take the risk. And you have to have an infrastructure or management that's willing to take those risks if the policies are not in place and if the funding's not in place. And if you are able to do that, and not every airport is, but if you're able to do that, then some of these plans that we have in place will come to implementation.
Yeah, and credit to Katie and the airport. They're going to be ready a lot sooner than we are to plug into an electric charging facility to charge our electric airplanes, because they are so visionary and ahead of the game that they are developing airport infrastructure to serve something which doesn't yet really exist. There's no good practical airplane for us to use yet.
So kind of what I'm hearing, just to sum this up, you know, it's not just about the airlines, it's not just about the airports or even the OEMs or the policy side. Sustainable aviation is also about ground transportation. It's about the different ways that you can access different areas. Is that right, Dan?
Yes, and you know, listening to one of the earlier presentations, the one about food, for example, I mean, it's not a surprise that if you let investor-driven food companies drive our nutrition, we might end up with a lot of overweight people with diabetes. Or if you let drug companies design healthcare, that we end up with a lot of people who have substance abuse issues. It's the same in any sector. If we allow the private sector that is entrepreneurial and designing incredible future forward-looking technologies to decide what our transportation should look like, you're going to get outcomes that are consistent with investor return, but not necessarily consistent with good public policy. I ask you all to really think about that, because right now you're going to be hearing, or you may be hearing, about urban air mobility. Has anybody heard about urban air mobility? So these are what are called eVTOL, electric vertical takeoff and landing craft, that are going to provide urban air mobility. That is to say, if you need to go from one side of town to the other, then you can go up to the top of the building and get in an eVTOL and be flown across in an electric quiet airplane. And I hear that, and as an aviation person, I just love it. It's entrepreneurial, it's emerging technology, there's just so many cool things about it. As a public policy person, I'm thinking, you gotta be kidding me. I mean, the failure of surface transportation has driven an economic opportunity for someone to create a vehicle which flies from rooftop to rooftop so that really wealthy people can avoid what we didn't invest in, which is adequate surface transportation. And so if you look, there are places in the world, like I was in Denmark a couple years ago, they've just redone their subway system. They don't need urban air mobility if you can go down underground and get somewhere anywhere in the city in 10 minutes. It is a concession to a failed surface transportation. And so I would just ask us all, you know, as we have a finger on the scale for good outcomes in public policy, this is not about building infrastructure so that the private sector can do what it wants. It's about deciding what we want to do and then engaging the private sector to deliver the technology and the vehicles to do it with. That may or may not be a paradigm shift for some of you, but it's, I think, really important. And not just about aviation. It's true in utilities, it's true in food, it's true in healthcare, it's true in everything.
I have to agree with Dan, because one of the things that I was keen on at the airport was making sure that we had transportation for the masses. Many of you have heard, I'm sure, of some of the airports that are on the Cape or in Long Island, that there's a lot of corporate and business type aircraft that are mainly using those facilities. And that is true, but about 60% of the activity at the airport is corporate aircraft. However, for the masses is what we're looking for. To get Cape Codders who are now, after COVID, there's a lot more people living on the Cape, they have a need for reliable transportation, and you have to look at what that balance is to get those masses to their destinations. and that whether it's surface transportation, whether it's aviation, there has to be a way that's for the masses, not just the eVTOL, that is for the people that can afford it. There's less people that are in that realm, percentage-wise, that can afford those types of planes. You need to look at what transportation does for our community as a whole.
And by the way, we have something right now that provides urban air mobility. What's it called? It's called a helicopter. So when I listen to these people talk about, we're going to be building vertiports on the top of these buildings, they're already there. They're called heliports. And the thing is, if you see helicopters flying around urban areas, a lot of times it's medevac and stuff, which is a really good use. But it's not like this is a new idea. They're simply looking to replace the helicopter. And it's not going to be cheaper because the infrastructure required to put the kind of kilowatts at the top of a skyscraper that are going to charge these eVTOLs, I can't even imagine how expensive that's going to be. And you use it 10 or 20 times a day, it would take 1,000 years to amortize the cost of putting it up there. So my advice to any of you who are looking at investing in one of these companies that's doing eVTOLs is just think long and hard about it. Because the market cap of those companies is obscene right now. But I, as an aviation person and a policy person, I'm looking at it and thinking, where's that going to be used?
Well, so that's a great segue, Dan. Oops. Well, there's supposed to be a slide here that comes from IATA, which is the International Air Transport Association, which represents the biggest airlines globally, so the major ones that you all can name. And when they take some of these different levers into context, new technologies like electric and hydrogen, some of the offsetting that the airlines are doing as well, those make up a small chunk of their overall 2050 net zero strategy. There's another chunk that takes up, almost 65% of their 2050 net zero strategy, and that was SAF. And somehow, we're gonna have to cover SAF in 5 minutes. Now, I know some of you have heard this term, sustainable aviation fuel, but I want to demystify this. Can you tell us exactly what SAF is and how it works in practice?
Sure. So from an airport infrastructure, SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, how it comes to the airport is in its existing transport in a fuel truck mixed with the other fuel. It's just how it's made and how it's transported and where it's made. So from an airport infrastructure standpoint, we really don't have much to do with that. Massport right now, who owns Logan Airport, Worcester Airport, and Hanscom Field, is in a consortium. They're in a group that's looking to see how they can get sustainable aviation fuel easily implemented here on the East Coast, basically from Maine down to the South Coast, where they have easy transport for that type of fuel. Right now, the problem is that there's a production problem. So we know that we can transport it to an airport. That's not a problem. It's just, where is it going to be made? How is it going to be piped into those locations? And where does it make sense to draw from the farmers who are basically making this sustainable aviation fuel? And Dan's going to talk about what does that do to the farmers that are now not going to produce that food source rather than the sustainable aviation.
The reason I'm smiling is as we approach the close, we've stumbled into another oxymoron in aviation, which is sustainable aviation fuel. So right now, first of all, what it is, because a lot of you probably don't know, think ethanol. When you pull up to a gas pump and it's got like 20% ethanol, sustainable aviation fuel is either pure or a blended of agriculturally grown fuel. So it's soybean product, or it could be an algae product. It's a really interesting idea. Right now, as I said, less than 1% of what's flying over us is using it. To get to 100%, the impact, as Katie suggested, on agriculture, on food production, on the type of environmental impact of actually growing all that stuff, and the farm equipment needed to harvest it, and it's just. Don't necessarily believe it until you start to see it. So just like with any industry, there's a tremendous amount of greenwashing that's going on in aviation. So approach anything you're hearing with a bit of skepticism. And I think we need to do hybrids. We talked about hybrids. All electric is never going to work with a 200-passenger airplane. But there are hybrid technologies and there are hydrogen technologies that actually can really reduce the carbon footprint. You may have gleaned, I'm not a huge believer in sustainable aviation fuel as a grown and refined product. I just think the numbers are really problematic.
And if I asked you both, Dan and Katie, to kind of take a look at these different levers here and choose, what do you think is really going to move the needle in sustainable aviation? What would you choose?
I wouldn't choose any of those right now. I would choose a balance of those. If you're looking at 2050 of what aviation will be using in 25 years from now, I think you're going to see significant change. Technology is so quick and it's ever changing. And there's, before we know it, and in 2 years from now, there's going to be a whole new battery technology that we never thought of. So I think that if you combine all of those, I think that pie chart is going to look different. I don't think that 65% is going to be sustainable aviation fuels. I think it's going to be probably cut in thirds with some other sources. You all know that, technology changes so quickly that when we are talking to you in 25 years from now, it's going to be a completely different picture. But the thing that we have to remember is that we're working towards trying to find a solution. And I'll use the word balance again, when you balance all of these steps and all of these tasks together, then as a community, we're coming up with a plan that can be somewhat sustainable with all of these different pieces of technology melded into one.
Yeah, I agree. There isn't a tech. What was the rule that storage in computers was going to double every year? Whose rule was that? Not him. Which? Moore's Law. Thank you. I knew someone here would remember that. So the idea was that battery storage was going to do the same thing. That batteries were going to double every year, and then the energy density would be there to do all electric. That's just not true with battery storage. So as Katie said, we don't know what technologies are going to emerge. There's a lot of cutting edge stuff going on with aluminum oxide batteries and all different kinds of battery storage, but it's not there yet. And so I'm with Katie. We have to look at, as new technologies emerge, is what's the best we can do today? Because no one is suggesting doing away with air travel, but we do know there's a significant environmental impact from what we're doing, and we need to be working on it. And that's why it's great, the partnership with your airport and other airports and some of the public policymakers has just been really, really exciting.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. We're out of time here, but I do want to see if anyone in the room has questions for the panelists. Yep, all the way back there. Dan, do you want to take that? You seem hesitant.
I'm biting my tongue. There is no good reason and there's no good excuse for that. There really isn't. So, put pressure on. Tell them you're not going to fly them anymore if they don't clean up their act in the cockpit. Pete Farrell, can you come up with an answer for that?
Well, first of all, Dan created an airline that doesn't give out drinks.
Right. We don't give you shit on our airplanes. So. Yeah, that's a great example, though. The same airline that's going to ask you to buy offset miles, greenwash, is doing things that are not sustainable right under your nose. And so I think we need to start it. Exactly right. It is low-hanging fruit, and we ought to be going after them for it. There's another question, I think, right here. Yep. So to take it from 1%, less than 1%, to 5%, to 8%, maybe, but to get it to 100% is really, really unlikely, because it isn't just a question of does the product exist. It's a question of bringing it together, preparing it to refine it, creating a refinery for it, all of those things. So it really is transformational to get to a significant number. And I haven't seen a believable plan that we're on the road to do that. So the answer is yeah, there's probably enough byproduct. I mean, they're talking about using fat from the friolators in restaurants and stuff. I mean, yes, but, I mean, I want to see the plan before I believe it.
So one of the challenges for countries trying to reach the Paris Agreement is that international airlines are not part of the nationally determined contributions from each country. Do you feel that there is any legislation or policy or any way that we could ensure that airline aviations are included in those nationally determined contributions, perhaps from the country where they're registered? Or what do you think would work there?
Oh, that's a policy question, and you know, I swore not to get political here, so I'm not going to. But you know, currently under this administration, no. Could we actually do overflight? You know, there are a lot of different policy things we could implement that would actually address that, but it's going to take time to get there.
We can take one more.
Katie, the comment that you made was about in a situation where there's not funding and there's not policy, you have to take a risk. And I'm curious about what that looks like. Like, of course, you have leaders with vision who can see how it's an intelligent investment and how it's ultimately like a risk mitigation technique from a policy lens. But when you are in a situation where you have to persuade others and gain buy-in, how do you make the case for that?
You have to be a good cheerleader. And when I was at the airport, we ended up completing 2 strategic plans for the airport. And every single time we did a strategic plan, it was one of my highest priorities to have green technologies implemented into that, so that there was a policy in place for the airport that we are going to use some of our reserves to be able to implement charging stations if funding isn't available. So it really takes somebody that's passionate about that to go beyond and make sure that it's part of their measures for milestones that the airport wants to reach, and you bring people along with you. If you talk about it loud enough and long enough, somebody's going to listen to you. And that's what I did. And I think having the cheerleaders at Cape Air available to me, it was conversations that we would sit down with the airport commission and say, this is really important to us. Look at the green technology that's already in place at this airport. When you say that, you say, we want to be number one. Because each airport commission, they want to be able to say, oh, we were number one in that. So you use the right language to persuade folks that you're working with that it is a good thing to do, and it is a good thing to do for not only publicity, but for your community. And I think, especially on Cape Cod, people are passionate about where they live and where they work. I've seen it in other communities, but not like Cape Cod. Cape Cod is very unique. And when you have a passionate group of people that love where they live and where they work, they're going to do what they can to make sure that things are implemented in their facilities or in their infrastructure surrounding them that makes sense for the community. So it was easy for me to convince our board that that was the direction we wanted to go in. I think other airports could have difficulties doing that, but you have to be a cheerleader first and foremost and have good partners.
Yeah, and I would just say, too, I mean, our Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce always says our environment is our economy. It is. There should not be a planning document, and I mean, I would urge you all to put the pressure on. There should not be a planning document, whether it's an airport planning document, whether it's a town master plan, or that doesn't include a chapter on sustainability and climate change. I know that these are considered to be woke words now, so I apologize, but they're really not. And so, you know, we should be putting pressure on any planning document that doesn't include it. You just raise your hand and say, I think you left a chapter out. You got to go back and do that, because responsible entities are doing it. But a lot of entities, believe it or not, are still doing these 5 and 10 and 20-year master plans, and they're not including climate change in the plan, which is it just seems such a waste. So just wearing one other hat, I also serve right now as the current president of the board of the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative. And that's one of our functions, is to make sure that the entire community, whether it's public or private sector, is looking at what is happening to our climate and what we can do to both mitigate it, but now we're really talking about adaptation, resilience, and in some cases, retreat. And those are the conversations we just need to be having.
Well, thank you both so much. This was really interesting for me, and I assume for everyone else as well. So thank you for joining.
Thank you.